Well, thanks for having me today. It's good to be a part of this. Good to get to know Conservation Nebraska. As Alicia said, my name is Justin Carter. I'm a project associate for the Center for Rural Affairs. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about rural food security and in the context of environmental effects, the effects of climate change. I'm going to go a little bit into our agriculture system and some of the things we're doing, some solutions that we can take to help solve some challenges. So here we go. To get into it, I'd like to give you a little bit of information on the Center for Rural Affairs. So we are an independent nonprofit. We were founded in the year 1973, and our main office is located in the little town of Lyons, Nebraska, in Northeast Nebraska. Our mission is essentially to build strong and vibrant rural communities. And we do this through a lot of different ways. What I work on mostly is grassroots education and a lot of agriculture assistance, working with beginning farmers, working within the food system. We also have a community inclusion program that works with a lot of immigrants throughout the state of Nebraska, as well as on our Native American lands in Nebraska. We have a small business arm of the organization that does a lot of business startup education and awards micro enterprise loans. And then we also work on rural policy. All right, so to give you a little idea of who I am, what I mostly work on, Alicia alluded to it a little bit. Most of my work's with beginning farmers, do a lot of work with land transition, helping families keep the family farm and transfer it from one generation to the other. I work a lot on a program called Farm to School that assists schools in procuring local food from the region, from farms in their community, and also boosts up agriculture education. I do a little bit of work in rural business development in small towns, and then I coordinate the Nebraska Food Council, which I'll get into a little bit more throughout the presentation. All right, so throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about food systems. So what is a food system? A food system can be a lot of different things. We have giant food systems, our global food system, our national food systems, our regional food systems, and then we have local food systems. There's a lot of different definitions, but this is generally what I think about as a food system. It's a circular model that starts with production, goes into transformation and processing, where you see a crop, an animal turned into a food product. And then you move into distribution and marketing, where your product might end up at a retail store or maybe goes directly to the consumer. It's then purchased by that consumer and then consumed. And then another element to this cycle is resource management. We'll talk a lot about different resources tonight, but I consider it really how we manage our natural resources, our soils, our waters, and put those into food production. And then there's a lot of different areas that assist the food system, support the food system, and we call these asset areas. So things like education, policy, equity, our economy, environment, and wellness. All right, so let's start out by getting a little glance at Nebraska's food system. So I'm going to focus mostly on production throughout this presentation, as we're a heavily producer state, agriculture being our key industry. So Nebraska's got just a little bit over 1.9 million people. When we talk about food insecurity, and we'll get more into those definitions in a bit, most recent numbers we have is about 12.3% of Nebraska households have been food insecure. And that's from 2018, so that wouldn't include numbers from the pandemic. And it might be a bit higher. Projections for that are coming out kind of as we speak. Children, unfortunately, the rate of food insecurity tends to go up for children, and most recent number is at 16.7%. So diving into our agriculture production, we have a massive amount of land devoted to agriculture in the state of Nebraska, 45 million acres. the vast majority of it being committed to ranch lands as well as commodity crops, corn for grain, corn for silage, soybeans, things like that. Cattle industries are huge. Hogs and pigs also pretty big. We have a growing poultry industry as well. I think it's important to point out that we have a lot of different crops in Nebraska that people aren't aware of too. So you'll go to different parts of the states, you'll find a wide variety of things like different types of wheat, barley, sorghum, oats, sugar beets for sugar, as well as dry beans. If you go all the way out to the western side of the state near Scotts Bluff, you'll see a lot of dry bean production, and we're actually the #1 producer of great northern beans in the country and the #2 producer of pinto beans. So a fun fact there. And something that we talk about a lot at the center and that factors into my work is Nebraska has this sort of motto, this state pride that we feed the world. And we do, in a sense. A lot of what we produce in Nebraska goes to other places. It goes into things like cattle feed, and it has a large impact on the global food system. But we don't very often feed ourselves. If you look at what we spend on food annually, Nebraska spends around $4.4 billion on food annually, and about 90% of that comes from outside the state. So while we feed the world, we rarely feed ourselves. All right, so I'm gonna dive into just a few environmental effects of our agriculture system, some environmental effects that have been a result of climate change, as well as some things that we've done to add to the problem of climate change. As I go through this, I think it's important to keep in mind rural areas as really a foundation of our agriculture economy in Nebraska. So our economy would not survive without our rural areas. And in turn, these rural areas are so dependent on their natural resources. Their soils, their water often are their livelihoods. All right, so not to start out all doom and gloom, but I want to talk a little bit about catastrophic weather events, something we're seeing more and more in the United States and, of course, globally. A good quote that I like is from our state climatologist, Martha Shulsky. She says that these strong catastrophic events, you can compare them to a Major League Baseball player on steroids, a home run hitter. So a home run hitter will always hit home runs, but if he's on steroids, he's going to hit home runs a lot farther and a lot more frequently. And that can be compared to our catastrophic weather events. We're always going to have big storms, floods, things like that, but we're just seeing them occur in so much intensity and much more frequently. And nowhere is that more apparent than the 2019 floods that occurred in Nebraska. Those floods alone caused $1.4 billion in damage, and $900 million of that was in agriculture damage. So for some of these photos here, the photo on the bottom is actually from the derecho storm that occurred in Iowa this past year. But when you think about some of this damage, it's not just crops, it's not just livestock, it's also things like equipment, damage, destruction to grain elevators, things like that. Farmers losing their livelihoods to a point to where they just may not be able to continue in agriculture. And that has a long-term effect. That has a long-term effect on that community, that area, the economy of our state. We'll be hurting from that for a while. And then there's also this massive short-term effect when it comes to food insecurity. So the Food Bank for the Heartland, which distributes food to food pantries in most of the area that was affected by the floods, they gave out nearly 500,000 disaster relief meals just from March to July 2019. That's a pretty crazy amount of meals, and it really gives you an idea of how stranded people are and how quick food insecurity can become a reality. And of course, there are other threats as well. Hail has consistently been one of the biggest threats to farmers. It wasn't too long ago that crop insurance was basically hail insurance for farmers. And, that's something that we could see more down the road too. We see these large events that dump a lot of precipitation, a lot of rainfall very fast. But on the other side of that, different parts of the state, receive prolonged droughts that cause a lot of damage. We were in a pretty significant drought this past year. Windstorms, I mentioned the derecho in Iowa, that was a pretty freak weather event that we really hadn't seen happen before. And just the very notion of something like that coming out of nowhere is scary. And then pest outbreaks, another one. Drought conditions can, give way to infestations of different insects, weeds that can really wreak havoc on cropland. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about monoculture. So when I talk about monoculture, I'm considering the cultivation of a single crop over a pretty wide area. So we've traditionally grown crops, single crops, on a multitude of acres in a way that isn't necessarily bad, but the growth of monoculture in recent years is really startling now that you have corn, soybeans being grown on thousands and tens of thousands of acres at a time, and occasionally without rotation. And that causes a big problem. It causes a problem for wildlife habitat in that area. Nothing that isn't accustomed to that ecosystem can survive in there. And then everything that is accustomed to that ecosystem can survive in there and really get out of control, which is why you see farmers, spraying chemical pesticides for weeds, looking, for insects that get out of control in those areas. So big problem for wildlife habitats. Over the last two centuries, unfortunately, we've seen a loss of half of the organic matter and carbon from our topsoil, and much of this has been due to agriculture tilling. Now, there's been a push not to till agricultural land in recent years, and we can get into that a little bit later when we're talking about solutions. But it's really startling a lot, and that carbon that comes out of that topsoil goes into the atmosphere and contributes to climate change, the release of greenhouse gases. And then, of course, you have a lot of these crops that are being grown are very thirsty crops. Many of them are irrigated. They're in lands that experience droughts, and it can be hard on water resources. And then something that I work on a lot at the center is really the increase in the demographics of farmers related to age and the increase in farm sizes. Excuse me. So since World War II, farms have actually decreased in Nebraska from over 100,000 farms to down below 50,000 farms. Now, part of that is that our state has industrialized quite a bit over that time, but probably a larger part of that is that the family farm has kind of slowly disappeared. Back in the 60s, 70s, you could go to rural areas in Nebraska, go through the countryside and see lots of houses, lots of elevators, lots of barns. There was just a high amount of single family farms. And unfortunately, many of those family farms may have lost their farms recently. That land may have gotten consolidated, gone into a larger farm. And you start to see these large industrial farms that are tens of thousands of acres. And that can make it hard. I mean, a lot of the mechanization on these farms doesn't require a whole lot of labor, and it makes it harder for folks to break into this industry of agriculture, which is why if you look at the average age of a farmer today, in 2017, it was nearly 60 years old. I mean, that's just the lack of young people going into this industry is pretty startling. But at the same time, it's a little hard to blame them because the barriers to get in can be so great too. You have land prices being quite expensive. and just a lack of access to land in order to make enough money to survive, and also the financial resources to buy equipment, to find your market, depending on what you're growing. It can be very difficult, and we're kind of facing a situation where our farmers of today are aging out quite a bit, and we're looking for who's going to be the next generation to take them over. All right, so what does all this lead to? And a lot of times, unfortunately, it can lead to rural food insecurity in areas. Areas lose their populations, their economic opportunity, and food security can be an issue. And something that I always talk about at the Center for Rural Affairs is I grew up in a rural area. I grew up in Fort Calhoun, Nebraska, and I've been to a lot of different rural areas around the state. And one key characteristic is just hospitality. I mean, the folks are always so nice, and they're always willing to sit down with you over a meal. Food, having a meal is a foundation of that hospitality. And it's pretty hard to believe that you wouldn't be able to get food or have the same access to food in some of these communities, some of these areas. So before we really dive in, I wanted to talk a little bit about what food security is and what we mean when we say food insecurity. So the USDA defines food security, or food insecurity, sorry, a little error there, as a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. Sometimes food security is compared to terms like hunger and poverty. Hunger is more related to the physical discomfort of not having food, and poverty is an income threshold that is placed by the United States, by the federal government. Food security is also defined by the USDA, but it's a little different. Food security refers to a lack of the financial resources on a household level. I won't get into all of it because I don't think we have quite enough time, but food insecurity can exist on different levels. So a household can be very high food insecure, where they're experiencing a lack of food, a lack of resources to get food over a long period of time. Or they could be low food insecure, where it's only affecting them from time to time. And then some facts to look at: food security in the US was at 10.5% in 2019, and it's projected to be over 15% in 2020. So something I'd like to talk about is food deserts. Food deserts have become more prevalent in Nebraska over the years. A food desert is basically when someone cannot get easy access to good, nutritious food. So the USDA definitions are an area where at least 500 residents live in a low income area and are less than 10 miles away from a grocery store or a healthy, affordable food retail outlet. So we're talking about grocery stores, retailers here. We're not talking about a gas station or anything like that. We're talking about somewhere where you can get fresh produce, essentially. The 10 miles was for rural areas. The definition is the same for urban areas, except it's that retailer would need to be more than a mile away rather than 10 miles. So if you look at some of the statistics related to independent grocery stores in Nebraska, just in 1999, we had 1,600 independently owned grocery stores. 2019, there were only 500 independently owned grocery stores. And in just a 6-month period between 2018 and 19, 10 stores closed. Now, grocery stores close for a plethora of reasons. I honestly think that the biggest reason might be that the people who are running these grocery stores are just aging out. They're near retirement. Folks get older. They don't want to run the business anymore. They want to retire. And I think a big struggle that communities are having right now is there are no young people to take over these businesses. or they might have someone who wants to take over, but that person might not have the financial resources to run that grocery store. They become harder to run as they experience competition with bigger box stores that might be in larger communities, not that far down the road. And it can be a struggle to maintain as well. A lot of equipment and a lot of food safety regulations as well, especially if they're handling something like meat within the store. Oops. So here's a map of food deserts in Nebraska. Red is rural, blue is urban. As you can see, there's quite a few, or there's quite a many in the rural areas and also in the urban areas of Omaha and Lincoln. I think this map's kind of funny. It's from the US Census Bureau, and they classify urban as any area that has a population of at least 2,500 people, which would include some towns in Nebraska that you wouldn't necessarily call urban. That's why you see a lot of blue dots out in the western and central parts of the state. But as you can see, it's a real problem in Nebraska. All right, so when we're talking about food insecurity, I think it's important that we don't limit it to just availability and access of food, but also nutrition. It's really about getting access to good foods, healthy foods. And we can see that in Nebraska, that might be one of the biggest issues related to food security is nutrition. So if you look at the dietary behavior in Nebraska, just getting a serving of fruits or vegetables a day, 39.7% of adults and 37.8% of adolescents said that they consumed fruit less than one time daily. And 23.3% of adults and almost 40% of adolescents said less than one time daily for vegetables. Over on the side for health issues, obesity rates, 30% for adults, 12.7% for adolescents, and then overweight individuals, 36.5% for adults, 13.8% for adolescents. So, and when you go back to the causes for this, I think it relates to a lot of things like food deserts. It could be the lack of availability of food. It could also be the affordability. Unfortunately, for low-income individuals, it can be hard to justify buying fresh fruits and vegetables sometimes because they're often some of the most expensive things at the grocery store. All right, so looking ahead, it's not all doom and gloom. I think when you look at our rural areas throughout Nebraska, throughout the country, they're very known to be adaptive, resilient areas. They've adapted to environmental changes over the years. They've adapted to market fluctuations, rough economies over the years, and they can be very innovative communities. So there is certainly hope for these issues. I'll start with agriculture. Something that I like to say is tend the soil, not the crop. So we're fortunate that in recent years, there's been a lot of research, a lot of technological breakthroughs related to agriculture diversifications, things like crop rotations. And we talked a lot about monoculture. Well, if you can just break up your farm into a rotation, which was traditionally done with corn and beans, beans provided some of the nitrogen input into the soil that could be used for corn the next year. And that's just two crops, and that's okay, but we need to be thinking a little bit bigger too. More crop rotations on areas, and in turn, helping build up the wildlife and the biodiversity in those areas, and building up the health of the soil. So cover cropping, for instance, making sure that your soil is covered and not just bare for the entire year. I talked about losing that carbon, that organic matter. That's how you get it back. Putting plants on top of the soil that can sequester some carbon, bring it back down into the soil, and that aids with the problem of climate change in general. Another thing we like to think about is whole systems thinking. So thinking of your farm as sort of an ecosystem, thinking of the water and the soil resources. Don't think individually of the crops. Think of the things that have the impact on those crops. Think a little holistically. And then farm smarter, not harder. You know, making innovations that can allow you to grow more on a smaller piece of land is going to be huge down the road. You know, how can we produce more on less so we don't have to go farm where a wetland is or a grassland? How we can keep those ecosystems in place and still reap the harvest. And then something that I really like thinking about is shelter belts, and it's a little unfortunate, but it's cool, the protection that trees can provide. So shelter belts are basically these rows of trees. You might be driving through Nebraska and you'll see a giant row of cedar trees or pine trees that may be dividing a farm, dividing a property line. Many of those shelter belts were put in place back in the 30s through some of FDR's programs to help with the effects of the Dust Bowl. So they were put there to prevent soil erosion that was caused by the high winds. So stopping that wind. They were put there to trap snow, to put moisture back into the soil. They provided a habitat for a lot of birds, a lot of animals on those lands. So unfortunately, the culture of industrial agriculture has driven a lot of farmers to plant crops fence row to fence row, and we've lost a lot of those shelter belts over the years. In Nebraska alone, we've lost 57% of shelter belts, you know, in that period of time. So it's a very simple thing that we've known about for a while. And if we experience more climatic events with high winds, it'd be something that we could use again. All right, going back to the issue of rural grocery stores, of food deserts. So as often as we see grocery stores close in rural communities, we're starting to see a lot of grocery stores return to rural communities as well. And it's pretty cool to see a lot of them in different ownership models and really creative business structures. So the C Market grocery store in Cody, Nebraska is actually run by high school students. It's sponsored by the school. So it provides a food source for the town's residents, but it also provides an entrepreneurship class for the students. We've seen other models where towns have purchased the facilities to house the grocery stores. We've seen collective models that have had maybe the ownership of the town itself, or maybe just multiple owners. So you're taking the financial pressure off of a single person. We work on a lot of these projects and we direct a lot of these communities to the Nebraska Cooperative Development Center. They have a whole process where they'll sit down with community members, help them form a committee to really examine the needs of the community, the needs of the consumers in the community, how you can get the foods in that community that consumers want. So they really help it become a collective effort. Stacking enterprises is something that they've talked about a lot too. So can your grocery store also be a restaurant, also be a coffee shop? You know, things that will help the entrepreneur quite a bit. And something we can all do as individuals is support our local food systems. So back when we were talking about what a food system is, I had written supply and demand on that circle. Supply and demand are really, they're the drivers of the local food system. And demand is really the biggest driver. So you cannot have farms that produce local foods, meat processors selling out of butcher shops, rural grocery stores, selling food that's from the region. You can't have these things if you don't have consumer demand. So really looking at these businesses, buying their products, forming relationships with them, that's probably the biggest thing that the individual can do. And it really comes down to kind of voting with your money too. If you put your funds into the local food system, local food will become more prevalent. An area that we've been working with a lot is meat processors. So 2020 was a really hard year on the meat industry. When a lot of the industrial meat packing plants closed because of COVID-19, that product got pushed off to local butcher shops. Those animals went into those local processing facilities, and it really overwhelmed them. They got a lot of business, but they also got more supply than they could really handle. So that's an area that we're trying to help in the state right now, an industry that we're trying to break down some barriers for. So if you have a local butcher shop in your community, it's definitely a business to support. Farm to school, helping schools procure locally, putting some pressure to procure local nutritious foods is a big deal. It provides kids with home-cooked nutritious meals. It also can provide them with an agriculture education so they know where that food comes from. I've seen schools form good relationships with farmers, where they've taken students on things like farm tours so they can get an idea of what the career is like, maybe go into an agriculture career. Form or join a local food council or coalition. Food policy councils are something that are becoming more and more popular in the United States. They exist mostly on a local level or regional level. It could be like a county food council, a community food council. Nebraska actually has a state food council, but there's only a few of those. And really what they do is it's a group of folks that examines food issues in their community. Sometimes they do educational projects. Sometimes they'll take on a big community project like a rural grocery store, maybe a commercial kitchen, something like that. So I'll go into the Nebraska Food Council a bit. So the Nebraska Food Council is a statewide food policy council. It was formed in 2017 by the Center for Rural Affairs. We have members from all over the state and all over the food system. So we have a lot of farmers, other producers. We have folks who have worked in distribution, in retail. We have educators who are involved in farm to school, folks who work for nonprofits. If you work in the food system, you're welcome to join the Nebraska Food Council. Our work has been centered on both education and policy. We've held things called food chats where we've, talked about issues like food safety or cottage foods, policy. We worked on cottage food law in Nebraska. We're working on some farm to school policy right now. So it's a great group to be a part of, and feel free to contact me if you're interested in it. And yeah, that's what I have tonight. So thank you so much for listening to me. Hopefully we'll get some questions. And I guess just to close, I'd say, there's issues, there's problems out there related to the environment and food security, but I'm a believer that rural communities can adapt and we can build a more resilient future. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Denise asked if there's a possibility to get a copy of the slides. We are recording this right now, so it will be available later. Rita said thank you for the presentation.
I see the question up there from Trang. We recently had a meeting of the Nebraska Food Council in late January. We'll probably have another meeting in May, but we always have events. We always have happenings going on. You can feel free to email me if you like, and I'll put my email in the chat since we can't see my presentation anymore. Well, thanks. I'm glad you all enjoyed it.
James said, does Center of Rural Affairs work on issues in just Nebraska?
Our policy work actually extends to Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And then our policy team does some federal work on the Farm Bill as well. So our policy team is in quite a few places. The part of the center that I work in, the grassroots education, the small business work, that is focused just on Nebraska.
Karen asked, who hosts the Food Policy Council and where is it housed?
So the Food Policy Council is housed in the Center for Rural Affairs. We founded it not too long ago. It isn't its own nonprofit or organization yet. We have a goal that one day it'll get there. So we manage it, but it's made up of folks all over the state.
And then Janet asked, what alternative crop would you suggest for 5 acres tract of land? My soil type is poor.
I would suggest we talk about it separately. I think we could find some suggestions. It would be cool to learn a little bit more about the property. And I think I could put you in touch with some more experienced farmers who would have some helpful tips.
And she said, great about getting in touch. And then Rita says, one thing that is not really talked about, but is an ugly little secret, even though Nebraska is lower on the national scale, seems to be a gap with understanding food waste. Can you address this topic?
I agree. And I'm not as well versed in food waste, so I didn't go into it as much tonight. But nationally, yeah, food waste is quite the problem. It contributes to greenhouse gases. It produces a lot of methane when it's thrown into landfills. A lot of food waste can be repurposed pretty easily into things like compost. It's a hard topic to address. Just a lot of the systems aren't put in place to collect food waste, especially in Nebraska. I'm no expert in it, but I'd like to talk about it more.
Yeah. And then she also asked, would you say a public awareness program would be a great idea?
Yeah, absolutely.
It looks like that's all the questions we have. But I just want to thank you again, Justin. Oh, I guess there was one in the chat. Bruce said, wondering about farmer education and support. In spirit, I'm in agreement with everything. A little more complicated is convincing farmers who are looking at the bottom line financially.
Yep. It's difficult, I agree. We do a lot of work at the center in putting people in touch with FSA and getting loans. We've done coaching in that type of work before. I know folks who work at the Rural Response Hotline who have done quite a bit of work around family farming and work with beginning farmers. Financially, it is tough, but it depends on what you want to grow. And the education, there's education and support out there. There's a lot of good groups across the river in Iowa too that we work with quite a bit. So Bruce, If you have some ideas or would like to talk more, be willing to speak on that.
Yeah, and it looks like all we have. Again, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. Really enjoyed your presentation. And again, for everybody, when the webinar ends, a survey will pop up, and if you could please complete that, it'll let us know how you enjoyed the webinar.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.